I got a fair number of comments on one of my recent videos which basically asked me to delve into the fate, let's say, of the Rakatans. They were a major factor in Knights of the Old Republic. Their technology, their history, and their general impact on the galaxy was pretty substantial, but they just kind of disappeared as time went on, and as you guys know, I love me some Rakatans, so I get to make 2 videos about them in a week. Wonderful. Now, before we get into the really interesting stuff that I think many of you probably have never heard of, let's go a little bit into the past before Knights of the Old Republic and encapsulate all we know about the fall of the Rakata. I think if you're watching this, you probably know the gist of things. They had this vast empire, and the pinnacle of that empire was the Starforge. On their home planet, Rakata Prime, they built this incredible Force-attuned temple, and they named it the Temple of the Ancients. You've all been inside of this thing in the game. The purpose of this temple was to actually protect the Starforge. It essentially created a giant disruptor field that covered the entire star system, and it all stemmed from this temple. It would completely cripple navigation systems, communication systems for any ship that entered the system, meaning that nothing could get near the Starforge or near Rakata Prime. Because of this almost invincibility, they began to conquer and enslave countless races. However, a mysterious plague began to sweep through the Empire, and although it didn't kill them, it actually stripped them of their connection to the Force. Now, because much of their technology was based on the Force, many of their slave races actually saw this as an opportunity to rebel and to take on the once unbeatable slave masters. These rebellions and their loss of Force sensitivity eventually caused infighting, it caused political internal conflict, and so the remaining members of the Rakata fled their conquered worlds and returned back to their homeworld. As time passed, much of their really superior Force-based technology became kind of obsolete, and the temple that they built on Rakata Prime essentially allowed the planet to become a safe haven, but also a prison for those that survived. And so with all of the remaining Rakatas stuck on this planet, they did exactly what Rakatans do, and they began to turn on each other. What essentially happened is that they split into a number of factions. There were the savage Rakatans, and then there were the more reserved priests. While the barbarians waged war against each other, the priests essentially hid. They decided to live their lives contently in forests and jungles, away from all of the warmongering. The barbarians, on the other hand, created a vicious cycle of war that eventually devastated the planet. For thousands of years, they simply kept having wars, and then revolts, and then wars, and then revolts, and during one of these cycles of destruction, one of the warlords eventually ended up using a weapon of mass destruction, we could assume maybe nuclear weapons, to almost devastate the surface of Rakata Prime. Because of this devastation, it forced pretty much all of the Rakata to flee into underground caverns or cities. We don't exactly know what they were because we've never seen them. However, there was one remaining group on the surface that did manage to survive, and these became known as the Red Rakata. They stayed on the surface to analyze, to look through their history and to try and understand where they went wrong and how to better themselves to maybe keep the Rakatan species afloat. They eventually came to the conclusion that they needed to eradicate the Starforge to kind of wipe away their sins. However, they were stuck on Rakata Prime because they couldn't access the Temple of the Ancients because, as I said earlier, it was Force-based and they couldn't get into it and they couldn't get onto the Starforge to destroy it. They then spent thousands of years analysing and looking at their history. However, the Rakatans that fled underground a long time later eventually returned to the surface, and they were led by the one and only Black Rakata that we see in the game. But fortunately, the priests, or the Red Rakata led by the Elders, had managed to utilise some of their technology over time to keep them safe from the barbaric tribes that returned, and by this point they still wanted to atone for their sins, whereas the Black Rakata wanted to continue their savage way of life. Now, I'm not going to explain what happens in the game. If you're watching this video, then I assume you have played Knights of the Old Republic. I hope you have. But the Elders eventually came out on top. The One and the Black Rakata were essentially brought to an end by Revan. The barbarians are cut down, and all that remains are the Rakatans that wanted to atone for their sins. However, these Rakatans didn't want to stay on Rakata Prime. They believed that they had grown beyond the savagery of their ancestors, and so these Rakata actually joined the Galactic Republic, and they left Rakata Prime and they became storytellers. They would go around telling stories about their ancient empire that conquered the stars and their mighty technologies that shattered worlds, but because they were so rare, many people thought that they were just silly and that they were simply telling fairy tales and that none of it was true. And although the Rakata did join the Republic, there just wasn't many of them, and they weren't able to repopulate themselves, and over time, the storytellers eventually disappeared. And the same thing happened on Rakata Prime. There were just too few Rakata to maintain their species, and over the next few hundred years it began to dwindle to the point that they eventually died out completely, and Rakata Prime was left utterly devoid of sentient life. However, here's where we get to the good stuff that I bet you did not know. Just before the fall of the Rakatan Empire, a rather large group of Rakatans actually fled into the unknown regions. They took technology from the Starforge and they began to repopulate a number of systems. This space within the unknown regions became known as the Rakatan Archipelago, a region of unknown space that people just did not want to travel through. As I mentioned earlier, the Rakatans were often made up of warlords, barbarians, and priests, and they would often come into conflict with one another, and while most of the planets within the archipelago became isolated due to their lack of technology, there were two planets led by two tribes that actually came together in a way and tried to rebuild what they had lost. These two tribes were named after their planets, which were Tolpa and Makatak, and they essentially began to figure out their ancient technology, and at some point they actually rediscovered the ability to travel through space. They even brought many of their slave races to this archipelago, and over time there were new iterations of Wookiees and Selkath and Kumamga on these planets. However, Rakatans being Rakatans, these two tribes ended up competing against one another. However, they didn't destroy each other. And what happened was they actually began to rebuild their ancient technology. And not only that, they managed to recreate the Starforge, but on a much smaller scale, and I mean ridiculously small. They were more like orbital stations. And not only that, they began to rebuild things such as mind prisons, and they were even experimenting on one another to try and figure out how to reconnect themselves to the Force. And what's really interesting is one of these leaders, who was known as Ruthic, was very close to reconnecting herself to the Force. Now, while these two tribes were trying to reconnect themselves to their glory days, the rest of the tribes and planets within the archipelago were just warring and fighting themselves and other species, and it could only be assumed again that they had nuclear wars, as many of these planets within the archipelago were extremely devastated and radioactive. Now, much of this was at the back end of the Star Wars Expanded Universe, so we'll never be able to see what eventually happened to the archipelago. But if there's anything to take from this, is that the Rakatan Infinite Empire could have returned in future stories, and it could have started on one of these two planets with a brand new Starforge and a brand new star system enshrouding disruptor. But that essentially wraps things up. Aside from the archipelago hidden in the unknown regions that were relatively obscure and unknown, the Rakatans faded out and became nothing more than a myth in most cases. Their technology became ghost stories, and most of the impact they had on slave worlds became eradicated from their history. And I think it's a real shame that we never got to see the story of the archipelago expanded upon, because I think it could have been a fantastic story. But alas, it's a story that we will never see. There we have it. Now you know exactly what happened to the Rakatans after Knights of the Old Republic and before it, so you just got a hell of a lot of information, and if you did have a fabulous time, don't forget to hit the like button and perhaps consider subscribing if you haven't to the biggest growing Knights of the Old Republic community on YouTube. I'll see you guys in the next video. But until then, may the Force be with you. Always.